Hey everybody, it's Curse, and today I wanted to bless you with my Falconer build guide as well as my build challenge. If you've been following my channel, you already know that I'm going to be season starting as Warlock. And I like to take my time and really min-max my builds, so I might not get to Falconer for quite a while. I might even try a different class before I go Falconer. But I love to theory craft, and that's where this build challenge comes in. I'll walk you through my build guide, and if you can take this build, leverage some of the most important concepts in it, optimize it based on your preferences, and maybe based on how some of these skills and interactions work in the actual gameplay. And if you can take down tier 4 Jorah in under 20 seconds, as well as push Monolith Corruption over 300, I'd love it if you could send me your clips of you doing that, and then we could do a build highlight video. And if you're comfortable, you can come on the video and share your thoughts and findings about the build, what worked, what didn't, and how you got it to the power level that you did. That is the basic idea for my build challenge. Some of the parameters might change if 20-second Jorah is impossible, for example. But I do want to get people excited about Falconer, trying different builds out, and optimizing things as much as possible. And let's be real here. This build could completely brick. But remember, if it breaks, we pivot. And either way, I do believe you're going to get some value out of the tech I've brainstormed in this build guide. So check it out. See if you can utilize something for your build, or if you want to join in on the build challenge. And now let me walk you through the actual build guide. Irashaimase! Alright, let's start with a skill tree and how I imagine the different skills interacting together. The most important one is going to be Falconry by far. This is going to be our main source of DPS. By default, Falcon Strikes does 7 hits. We're going to boost that up to 11 hits. And then thanks to Hunter's Spoils, we should be able to self-sustain the mana for this skill relatively easily. I think ideally you want to aim for the 160 attribute mark for around 4 mana per hit, which is going to offset the 48 mana cost of the actual skill. Side by side right here reduces cooldown whenever we use any melee or throwing or ball attack skill. So in combination with Explosive Trap, this skill should be relatively spammable. And that's what we're trying to achieve here. We want smooth clear for monos, and at the same time spammable high DPS skills for bosses. Let's take a look at how we're going to boost the DPS. Falconer's Journey is a premium node. For a single point, we get 100% more damage when we get to level 100. And then if we can stack 100 plus dex, we get another 2 times multiplier. So together these should be stacking multiplicatively, resulting in at least 4x the damage if you can stack 100 plus dex. And keep in mind that this node, together with Hunter's Spoils, both pushes in a direction of wanting to stack as much dex as possible. Over here on the bottom, we get to convert our increased damage to Falcon increased damage. Go for the eyes, and I love the Baldur's Gate reference here, by the way. Cheers to any old school Minsk enjoyers right here. It's really hard to interpret and decipher exactly how it's going to play out. But from what I've heard from other people, it sounds like it takes your entire percent crit chance, not your base, not your percent increase, but the combined total, and gives 75% of that to your Falcon as a base crit chance, which is then multiplied by your minion percent increase chance. That seems like a really strange implementation to me, but let's assume that's how it works. Either way, we should be able to max the Falcon's crit thanks to this node right here. And I'll show you some secret tech utilizing this node later on in the video as well. Exposed Weakness is a great way to stack crit multi. Essentially, you can get up to 10 stacks against bosses, which translates to converting 250% of your additional crit multi, I assume, into crit multi for your Falcon. So if you have 150% crit multi on your hero, that translates to 375% additional crit multi for your Falcon. Incredible node. Make sure to take it, and we scale crit multi because of this one as well. Another really cool node is Avian Arsenal up here. I had to read it a few times in order to understand exactly what it's saying, but basically when we use a throwing attack, it's going to convert our throwing damage into melee damage for the bird at 30% effectiveness. And you can have 10 stacks of this buff, so you can potentially get 300% of your, let's say, throwing attack damage converted into melee damage for the birdie. Easy DPS right there. Wake of Wings looks like a really solid buff to traverse around the map. It's not haste, so it stacks additively with all your other movement speed buffs. So the build should be incredibly speedy for monos. And it also gives us attack speed to be able to throw traps even faster. At the bottom, we have a few additional more damage multipliers. If you don't have exactly 23 points, you can probably reduce some of these two at the bottom. Next, we have first of many solid utility skills that the Falconer has access to, and that is Explosive Trap. The reason why we use Explosive Trap is Sky Signal, as well as Free Lofting Bird. Sky Signal can give us a ton of Elemental and Fizz Pen, and Free Lofting Bird can reduce the cooldowns of our other abilities even further. To take advantage of the two, you just need to stack throwing attack speed and to cast as many traps as possible. So let's see how we go about doing that. The skill itself got nerfed significantly over the last few days just before 1.0 hit, so it's heavily bottlenecked by mana requirements now. The mana cost of the skill is 8, and we can add 2 more traps with every single throw with these 3 points without adding any incremental mana cost. So make sure to skill these 3 right away, because they're basically just free extra traps to proc Sky Signal and Free Lofting Bird. And then the question is whether or not we take Automated Bombardment for even more traps and Clustered Explosives for even more traps at the cost of significant mana increases. Once you start getting into these 2 nodes, you have to get Gelcor's Blueprint as well as Subtle Sabotage to reduce the mana cost of the skill. And I'm not 100% certain exactly how many of these 3 points we'll be able to get away with. This part of the build is going to require testing and trying out the different mana solutions that I have theory-crafted in this build, as well as seeing what items you end up getting during your run. If mana happens to miraculously be a non-issue, you can always take out Lightning Bomb and put even additional point into Clustered Explosives. If you happen to have all 3 points between these 2 nodes, the result should be 5 traps thrown with every single attack. On top of that, every single trap should get duplicated because of Trap Sprinkler and Automated Bombardment, resulting in 10 trap detonations per explosive trap attack. And that means 10 stacks of Sky Signal with just 1 attack. So if we can sustain the mana, we're going to get quite a bit of Elemental and Fizz Pen, as well as a ton of cooldown recoveries to be able to spam our skills even more. And this is why I'm posting this as a build challenge. I can't accurately predict how many points we'll be able to put in these 3 skills until I've tried it out. So please try it out and let me know if it's viable at all. Trebuchet is not really a must-have skill. Smoke traps is not really must-have either, because we might be exploding a lot of these traps right away. But if you have extra points, they don't hurt. Now let's look into Shift for our mobility. We're using a very standard spec for Shift. We got cooldown recovery and mana efficiency, tons of mobility, even more mana recovery, invulnerability while shifting, dodge per dex, and we're going to be stacking dexterity significantly. So this is pretty much going to put us at 85% dodge for 1 second after shifting. We want to create a shadow as well and not use it up with Shadow Cascade. This is going to get used in Dive Bomb, so keep that in mind. And we also get a 16% call. Now we have Dive Bomb, which is another utility skill. I don't want you to think of Dive Bomb as a damage source. I want you to think of it as a utility. It has a 5-second cooldown, and the damage is solid. However, we can reduce the cooldown even more with United Assault, and given how much we spam throwing attacks, Dive Bomb could be fairly spammable. The base mana cost is 12, which we then reduce to 0 thanks to Focused Hunter. And on top of that, we get 12 mana on boss or rare hit. I think this can scale very nicely with some of the other nodes in the skill tree. And note that we also get 36% CDR on shift. So this increases our monolith mobility, it increases our shadow generation, it increases our survivability, because shift is a tremendous source of survivability. So you must max rapid pursuit. Rushing Wings is to make the skill more efficient by reducing the delay. We don't care about the more damage. This is just to reduce the delay between activating it and the actual hits. And on Wings of Shadow is an interesting one. I'm not exactly sure how it's gonna work. Based on the short 1-minute videos on Dive Bomb, it looks definitely interesting. But the big question mark I have on it is whether or not each of these shadows proc the 12 mana on boss hit. I think they probably should. But again, this is a theory craft and we won't know until we try it. So if you can have 2 or 3 shadows on top of the boss, that can be 36 mana right there. Not only that, if you have Smoke Bomb on top of the boss as well, that might get doubled to 72 mana recovered with just 1 cast of Dive Bomb. And the way that I'm reading Birds Aren't Real, it sounds like the Falcon itself is not actually going to perform the attack and it's just going to be Shadow Falcons doing it, which would be great for us because then the Falcon is free to do Falcon Strikes while we still get all of the utility from Dive Bomb. So we have to test out how this node works exactly, but I think Dive Bomb could be an invaluable source of mana regen, especially against bosses for this build and for many other builds as well, by the way. So try this tech out. Let me know if it works. I certainly love sciencing things out, so I will appreciate your contribution in the name of science. Up here, we also have a 40% smoke bomb duration increase. This is just for a little bit of extra synergy with dancing shadows. The final skill that we have is smoke bomb. We want it to last as long as possible. And smoke and blades is a funny one here because it definitely double dips for our Falcon. First of all, it gives allies melee and throwing damage, so 20 melee damage for the Falcon. But then we also get throwing damage for ourselves, which then, thanks to Avian Arsenal, gets converted to melee damage for the Falcon. So great node to max out because of the double dipping for the Falcon and for ourselves. Not to mention that it stacks a bunch of times over those 4 seconds. Smoke bomb is also a great source of shadows, so we max out Umbral Assault. And here's another secret tech for you. Smoke bomb can add a bunch of crit chance to our bow attacks. And you might be thinking, we're not even using a bow. Why would we want bow crit? Well, it's because of go for the eyes, boo, go for the eyes. We don't currently utilize anything that increases our throwing critical strike chance, and all of our crit chance increases are generic, so they apply to both throwing and bow attacks. So by increasing bow base crit, that is going to be our highest crit chance. And this skill says a portion of your highest of your global crit chances now applies to the Falcon. So if the highest is bow, then the Falcon is going to get that benefit. With this node, we can max our bow crit, which then gets transferred as melee crit into our Falcon. Please science this out as well and let me know if it works. I think it should. Hopefully it turns out to be another cool tech that can fit many different builds. Other than that, we just get area or growth speed, a little bit of glancing blow doesn't hurt, whatever you want with smoke bomb. So the overall playstyle with the build, the way that I see it working, is during monos we spam Falconry and dive bomb as much as possible because Falconry regens itself with Hunter's Spoils, while Dive Bomb is entirely free and even regens mana for us. On top of giving us Shift CDR, we always use Shift off of cooldown and then Explosive Trap as needed. I'm not sure how much you really need Explosive Trap during monos. It might be pretty smooth even without using it. But once enemies get pretty tanky, you probably want to throw a few Explosive Traps just for the pen and for the CDR here. Smoke Bomb is mostly going to be used for boss fights and for tougher elites, I think. And when you're facing a tougher enemy, you can just stand your ground near them, with Smoke Bomb giving you shadows, which then give you mana thanks to Dive Bomb. And so you can spam Explosive Trap exclusively and generate incredible amounts of pen, as well as CDR, and damage with Falconry. Obviously Shift off of cooldown as well, just to keep up our survivability. I think this is going to be one of the highest single target DPS builds in the game. Or at least I hope so. And now let's look at items. In terms of core items that I would strongly recommend, the first one is Cradle of the Erased. There's a really cool tech with the passive tree that converts all of the block chance given from Golden Aegis into glancing blow chance. Thanks so easy again for that tech. So I do believe Cradle of the Erased is going to be best in slot for melee Falconer builds. It is a Weaver's Will item, so whatever modifiers you get, as long as there's a bunch of resistances on them, you can make do and you can essentially adjust your other item slots depending on what the Weaver's Will gives you. Another core item for the build is Morning Frost. We're gonna be speccing heavily into dexterity because of the great scaling it has with the build overall. So might as well throw Morning Frost in there also. The only downside is that Fizz and Cold Res penalty, so you have to make sure that you address that with the rest of your itemization. If you happen to get an LP Morning Frost, go for movement speed or CDR or just survivability, or Dex even is good as well. You have a lot of great options for modifiers. I've opted for Anchor of Oblivion for 2 reasons. One is that endurance is a lot stronger for Rogue because they can get 35% of their health total to become endurance threshold. So you have a much greater incentive to max out your endurance as a rogue. I definitely recommend it. This item maxes your endurance in just 1 slot, gives you a bit of endurance threshold, gives you armor as well, both in the implicit and by giving you 14 strength. And armor, by the way, received a huge buff, and I'll explain a little bit later how, but you definitely want to spec heavily into armor. We're also running Peak of the Mountain, and I do believe it should be a core item for the build. It's mainly for the critical strike chance increase. The downside of not being able to leech health does not impact this build whatsoever. The all attributes is great, it's just the perfect item for the build. It's also pretty easy to get 3 or 4 LP Peak of the Mountain, so try to get that. And if you happen to get at least 2 LP, I would go for Dexterity as well as levels of Falconry. The extra more damage multipliers in the Falconry skill tree can be quite impactful. We're heavily hitting our resistances because of Morning Frost, so I've opted for Omnis. That's obviously not going to be an early game setup, but when you start optimizing your build, and if you can get an Omnis from the shade, definitely think about slotting it in. Plus 1 level to skills is solid as well. Can't go wrong with that in this build. And then we have non-core items. I would certainly prioritize getting your resistances fixed up with all of your suffix slots in your chest, belt, rings, and gloves. In terms of rings, CDR and all attribute implicits I think are probably best. And then we want to reduce the throwing mana cost as much as possible. That also gives us throwing damage, which if you recall gets converted into melee damage for the Falcon. So it's a double bonus here that we get from this. Throwing attack speed, obviously really important as well. I wish we could get even dexterity in there. We just don't have the slots. The other ring is identical. We're utilizing the brand new Praetorian belt. Like I stated, armor received a significant buff in this patch. So I definitely recommend boosting your armor as much as possible. The belt slot is also going to be how we max out our reduced bonus damage taken from crit strikes. So make sure to get that. And these internal gauntlets, on top of the higher armor amounts for the Praetorian belt, is why I think armor got a boost in the patch. Being able to apply 24% of your armor mitigation to dot is incredibly useful, especially on top of the 211 armor that the gloves give you by default. Last Epoch does not give you many opportunities to mitigate dot damage. So getting that from your implicits on your gloves, I think is a solid option. And then I would opt for a tier 7 suffix, something defensive here, on top of tier 5 throwing attack speed and dexterity. If you want to opt for a more offensive option in your glove slot, Lyraka's Claws is probably your best bet. 130% throwing crit multi is going to buff your Falcon's crit multi as well. So keep that in mind. It's definitely a great option. It's just more of an offensive option versus the defensive bonuses of the Eternal Gauntlets right here. For chest piece, this new body armor, Falconry armor, looks great. In terms of modifiers, I've opted for tier 7 dex. Another super high priority is just getting your bonus damage from crit strikes reduced, as well as your cold resistance is maxed out. And if you happen to have extra forging potential, get some vitality as well in there. But the other 3 are higher priority. For weapon, I think Eagle Wing is a really solid option because it gives us generic base crit, which also applies to bow base crit, so it synergizes well with Shadow Hunter in Smoke Bomb. Our weapon is also going to be our primary source of crit strike multi, and then I would prioritize the armor shred. I think that's going to increase your DPS quite a bit. The third most important modifier is probably your crit chance, and then your minion melee damage is not as important because we already have so many sources of flat damage for the Falcon that this just gets diluted and doesn't give you as much as you'd like. Smoke Weaver here is probably a decent option. Only 2% crit though. The primary benefit for this dagger is utilizing the cooldown recovery for shift so that we can have even greater uptime on our invulnerability right after shift. However, the effective level for LP is 70, so I lean towards the Eagle Wing for this item slot. In terms of idols, just go pure defense. I have everything spec'd into health, a little bit of resistances, etc. Just utilize your idols to max out your res and to get as much health as possible. In terms of blessings, in the Black Sun timeline, either crit multi or health is most likely best in slot. For ending the storm, I would only go for mana because without it, our mana pool is just incredibly poor, something like 120 mana. This almost doubles our mana pool, so it's going to make the build quite a bit smoother. An alternative is getting lightning res, but we're already going all res, so I don't think that's a great option, honestly. Reign of Dragons, I'm a big proponent of all res if you've seen some of my other videos, so I would definitely spec into all res for Reign of Dragons. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I think armor stacking is better in this patch than previously. Despite the nerfs to these two nodes, I still think they're best in slot. For our passive tree, we get as much attack speed as possible for our throwing attacks. We're stacking dex, so this is a no-brainer as well. We're going to be moving most of the time, so evasion and agility are going to be must-haves. On the Falconry tree, we get a bit more base crit for the Falcon right here. This is the node I was referring to earlier. Maximum health gained as endurance threshold. Make sure to max this to get your survivability up. Dexterity stacking from Agile Hunt on top of Falcon throwing damage per 4 dex. You don't necessarily need to max it at 8. 5 is enough. But if you have the 3 extra points, this is where they can go. Throwing attack speed right here. Extra damage for the Falcon. This gives our Falcon even more flat damage for their melee attacks based on our throwing damage. So really good synergy with the build overall. And this deflect and weave is what makes our shield best in slot. You can see that it disables blocking and it converts your block chance to glancing blow. I think we should never be proccing the condition that makes us lose our golden aegis stacks. So we'll be sitting at 4 golden aegis stacks at all times, and all of that block is going to become glancing blow. Really cool wombo combo right there. Make sure to utilize it in your builds, assuming it works, of course. Health gain on Falcon hit per 3 decks, and remember Falcon strikes hit 11 times. Intuitive connection is a must-have as early as you can, because Falconry and Dive Bomb do have a bit of a cast time, and being able to remove that is going to make the build a lot smoother. Needle-like precision double dips for this build, because our crit multi gets translated into crit multi for the minion, and then it already gives the minion 36 crit multi on top of that. The crit chance increase is also a double dip, so make sure to get it. I already talked about how I think armor is going to be great in the patch, so getting 3 armor per dex, given that we're stacking 100, 120 decks, this is going to give us 300 to maybe 400 armor. We also get the benefit of increased percent armor on Falcon hit for 4 seconds. Given that Falcon strikes are 11 hits, that's 22% increased armor right there on every single Falcon strike. If we're fighting bosses and we get to spam Falcon strikes as well as Dive Bomb, that might be something like 10 to 20 attacks per second, but it's going to add a bunch of survivability to the build. Tailwind is solid, move speed, damage taken while moving reduction, and we're going to be moving a lot when in monos. Cloak of Shadows is an incredibly powerful node. 16 glancing blow and 8 decks, must max right here. More decks stacking from the marksman tree, as well as 20% crit vulnerability chance. This is going to increase our crit chance when we're not in Smoke Bomb. I think during Smoke Bomb we should have max crit, but a little bit of crit vulnerability doesn't hurt, especially for a 4-point investment. And now let's take a look at the overall stats for the build. I have everything set at average. If you go to max, everything is way above the caps. I like to set average when I'm using Omnis because you're never ever going to get max res on your Omnis. These resistances are not a very fair representation of what you might be able to get. Just keep in mind that you can also min-max and optimize your res based on your idols at the cost of health. So just adapt your build to max your resistances right here. We have 125 to possibly 135 dexterity, and these stats add up to roughly 160, like I mentioned, for 4 mana per hit on the Falcon, giving you 44 mana on Falcon strikes if you are fighting a boss. It's really important to highlight the armor right here. Even though we're running Falconer, which is a rogue, we're still getting 59% armor mitigation. And that's before the boost we get from this passive right here. The armor mitigation is partially going to apply to dots. It's just a great way to supplement your survivability. Our dodge chance is not great. However, keep in mind that for 1 second after shifting, we're pretty much max dodge. Glancing blow is at 88%. With a few stacks of Dusk Shroud, it's maxed out. Endurance is maxed out with endurance threshold of 768 given our health pool. Keep in mind that you can also think about adding a little bit of endurance threshold in your item slots, but I would not recommend it unless you spec into tier 7 on your rings or something like that. The EHP calcs down here are not accurate. They give you block damage reduction, which is unfortunately turned off, so you should not be getting 26% DR from block. We also are not adding the dodge damage reduction for when shift is active for that 1 extra second, but I do think this build would be fairly tanky because of the bonuses you get from shift. Now let's talk about what the build might be lacking. I think the crit multi is not the highest. It's 349 right now. I think you can likely sneak in some additional crit multi from item slots here and there. There are also 2x2 idols that give you shared crit multi, which double dips as I mentioned. So that's not a bad option either. We might be spec'd into too much adapting throwing damage, getting quite a bit of diminishing returns to scale. So you may consider moving some of the throwing damage to other stats, but that's something that can be configured once the build is tested out. Cooldown reduction might be something else that adds a lot of value to the build because we want to spam shift and Falcon strikes and dive bomb as much as possible. So if you find some room for CDR, definitely sneak it in there. And in terms of rating the build and what I think the strengths will be, I think committing to rating the build without having actually tested it is kind of silly, but I expect it to be really solid for single target. And because of all of the cooldown recovery options that we have, it's probably fairly smooth in monos as well, but it's just hard to tell. The tankiness should be great, not 20,000 ward great, but still great because of all the mobility and damage reduction that we get. I'm not sure how good this will be as season starter. You definitely won't have all of these uniques. I don't think you need them though. I think you can slowly build into them. And many of our sources for crit chance are coming from our skills and passives. And that's usually what holds back crit-based builds to be great season starters. So this build might work out as a decent season starter, but I don't think it will be phenomenal. And that's the build guide, everybody. I hope you got something out of it. And please let me know what you think about the build challenge. Obviously, some of the parameters might change. 20-second Joro is fairly aggressive. Not very many builds can do that. I'm setting that up with the expectation that this build performs extremely well against single target. But if that turns out not to be the case, we can always adjust it. I'll put a channel on my Discord to discuss this challenge. And if you like the idea of me theory crafting a build and letting the community just have fun with it, because simply put, I'm very time constrained and don't have the ability to test out every single class and every single build out there. So teaming up with other min-max enjoyers, I think could be a lot of fun. Anyway, 1.0 launches tomorrow. So if you want to watch my progress on Warlock from level 1 to 100, join in and let's have some fun. Anyways, take it easy and go chisso sama deshita.